talk about unplugged, which might be a difficult word to pronounce tonight, since everything is about digital and how electricity is becoming a protagonist of what we do as architects. And I'm going to talk about the future of texture and how that changed in the past few years and is going to change even more in the future. The idea is that we don't know what textures, we know what textures was, and we know what texture is doing to us now. And there is a very different relationship with what we touch now than what we touched a few years ago. And there is a weird desire to return to this tactile, analog, past idea of materiality. And this is maybe what I was hoping to talk about tonight. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that scanning somehow took the place of modeling, or it will. We were used through digital means to construct geometry, because that's what we used to do before computers. And now I think we passed that phase of transition between what we know, what we knew how to do, and what we think about what the future should be. And we bypassed the idea of modeling into scanning. So Google Maps and things of that kind went from being bidimensional problems or picture-taking problems to three-dimensional scanning. Also, textures became predominant over the idea of shading. So we are now not anymore spending time on the computer trying to find that perfect shade for the perfect material for photorealistic rendering, but actually we're going straight to the source. And you can scan your own face, like I've done here, you can see your face inside. To the point that you actually are going to scan materials instead of having to spend many, many hours in front of the computer to find the right outcome for visualization. That changes a little bit the story of architecture and how we understand digital tools and how we visualize them. To the point that I think that picture will take over images, meaning that the picture becomes actually the place where creativity for architects and in general for creative people will start operating onto. So images and picture are very different in this language. Now picture is a place of the pictorial. And these are some examples of scanned three-dimensional cities that paint over and over themselves to the point of actually changing the reality of the geometry, to the point of creating fantasy. And that brings me to the idea of fake analog, which is what we really are going towards, I think. Instead of the idea of geometry, which we've been attached for many years. And what I mean for faked analog is that we're still attached to the idea of the fingerprint, meaning the idea that there is actually somebody that creates architecture, that there is a fingerprint of the artist, and that is part of the process of making, and that still becomes part of the output, which is clearly faked by now because we're scanning digital prints, we're scanning the fingers, and the fingers become part of the artwork and architecture in general. So this idea of the relationship between fake analog and ideal digital, I think is very much part of what also engages the public, meaning for many years we've been talking to each other only, and I think that there is a point now where actually technology opens up to the large public, and the relationship is not anymore a relationship of technology among practitioners in the field, but actually a relationship with the viewer. And so I just put this slides on to understand the big difference between still nature and tableau vivant, and meaning that still nature is a disciplinary problem of architects in general, people that talk about tools, whereas we're at the point where this has been overcome with the idea of the fruition of architecture to the public, the idea of touching, believing it, and the idea of actually the moment of fruition. And we're at the point where literal becomes more important than abstract, which is difficult to say for architects, but it's definitely true. So things that are figural, literal, are much more relevant than abstract geometry. or where photorealistic is more important than ideal. And we have seen many of those scanning tools that are allowing us to import reality into the computer. And finally, we find, I think, a way through the computer to go back to certain things we knew how to do, how to paint and sculpt as a creative person, and how analog things can then become digital, and how then certain effects we would be using through materials to create artwork in general are completely replaced by technique on the computer. And so these are some examples in which materiality completely is faked by the computer. And that's the last part of the issue, is when photorealistic becomes fantastic. And fantastic, I think, is also the future and is taking over the power of narrative in culture. And these are some of the examples. And finally, I think the last twist is that if we've been in an exotic conversation, actually I think the familiar is much more going to be what happens in the future than the exotic. The field is not anymore closed into itself about very specific tools, but it's actually about how these tools are able to continue in the culture in general or express their importance in culture. And these are some examples of students' work using scanning and familiar elements to create fantastic landscapes. And this is it. Thank you.